Paying tax with art. I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood, I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And we're joined today for this episode by Michael Clarke, Chair of the Acceptance in Lieu panel, and Sarah Posey, Director of Cultural Property at Arts Council England. Hello, welcome both.
Hello.
Hi. Well, I'm so pleased that you could both join us. And I don't actually think that I can best introduce you, that I can do you justice. So I'm going to take the easy way out and ask you both to, in turn, just say a few words about what your roles are now and how you came to be in them, what your careers have been. Michael, would you like to start?
Yes, I worked for 43 years in the public museum and gallery sector in both local authority, university and national institutions. I retired from that 9 years ago. I've been director of the National Gallery of Scotland for about 15 years. And I joined the panel, quite a long time ago now, I think about 8 years ago as a panel member, which I found endlessly fascinating. And about a year and a half ago, I became the chair of the panel.
Brilliant. And we'll come on to what the panel is and what you do. But first, Sarah, would you like to say a word or two?
So I am Director of Cultural Property at Arts Council England. And within that role, it covers the various schemes which Arts Council delivers on behalf of the government, which includes acceptance in lieu, but also the cultural gift scheme, the government indemnity scheme, export licensing, immunity from seizure, and also the work of the reviewing committee on the export of works of art and objects of cultural interest. So I am responsible for the policy and scheme development around those cultural property schemes. The policy sits with DCMS, but we deliver the schemes. My background has all been in museums before I joined Arts Council 4 years ago. I've headed up an independent regional museum. I've worked for a large local authority-run museum service and also spent many years as a specialist curator in a national. So I've seen the museum sector from all sorts of different perspectives.
So do you want to explain to us what the Acceptance in Lieu scheme is?
Absolutely. And it's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about it. There are two ways of looking at it, actually. On the one hand, it is the most fabulous means of bringing art and cultural objects into the lives of millions of people, secured for public benefit. And what's been achieved through the Acceptance in Lieu scheme to enrich our public collections, a government scheme to support museums, galleries, libraries and archives is extraordinary. If you look at it another way, Acceptance in Lieu allows those who have a bill to inheritance tax or one of its earlier forms to pay the tax by transferring important cultural, scientific or historic objects and archives to the nation, and material accepted under the scheme is allocated to public museums, archives or libraries and is available for all.
So why does the scheme matter? I mean, Michael, you talked about your experience with it. Why do you think it's so important?
Well, in today's cultural climate, sadly, we've seen a few public institutions accepted a dramatic decrease in the funds available for those institutions, be they museums, galleries, libraries or archives, to enrich their collections through their acquisitions budgets. I mean, I can remember in the early 90s at the National Galleries of Scotland, we had an acquisition, it seems fantastic, we had an acquisition budget from the government of £1.8 million, and that was just, for starters. Now, I think it's perilously close to zero. I think that in many metropolitan and regional galleries, their purchase funds are negligible, and national institutions have also seen the real monetary value of their acquisitions budgets slashed and then just decline with inflation. So I think we are a vital, providing the conditions of AiL can be met, we are a vital lifeline to these institutions to help them in acquiring certain items. And thank you, Richard, very much for staging this podcast, because we want the knowledge of this scheme to be made available to as wide a public as possible, not just the public institution sector, but also the tax planning sector in the legal profession.
Well, can I leap in here? Because I'm so excited to have you both on the podcast because I've been longing to ask you certain questions for donkey's years, and this is finally the chance. And actually, the one I'd like to really start with, it's not the most popular question, but I'm going to ask it because it's the one that is often put to me whenever I talk about the AiL scheme. There's always someone who says, but hang on, why are we giving tax breaks to the rich? So I guess I'd like to ask you what you say to people who say that the AiL scheme is a tax scheme in favour of rich people.
Well, the starting point has to be that it certainly has to be the estate of somebody who is liable for inheritance tax. That said, that tax is then offset by the accepted value of the work of art or objects offered in lieu of tax. And it's a straight financial transaction whereby at the agreed value of the offered object, that amount of inheritance tax is settled. So it's not a gift to anyone. You can ultimately reduce it to the equivalent of hard cash terms. For example, if you offer in lieu of inheritance tax an object that has an accepted value by the AiL panel of £100,000, you would initially be liable for £40,000 of that at the current rate of inheritance tax, 40%. So that's 40,000 you owe. But you would get an additional douceur of 25% of that £40,000, i.e. a quarter of that, bring that up to £50,000, so that when you come to pay your inheritance tax with the agreed value of that offered work of art or object, you don't get £100,000 towards your inheritance tax, you get £110,000. And it's also been calculated that taking into account the cost of selling works privately, agents' fees, VAT, etc., the real net value to you is an increase. So there is a considerable incentive financially, let alone the good you're doing for public collections, because these all end up in public ownership for the public to enjoy.
So in terms of an owner or the estate working out whether it's worth going down this approach from, what sort of resources do you have in terms of finding out what's going on?
Yes, thanks, Richard. We'd love people to go and find out more and spread the word. So on the Arts Council England website, we've got a leaflet about the acceptance in lieu scheme, which sets all of that out and provides an example, as Michael has done just now. There's also a wonderful publication that was jointly prepared by Art Fund and Arts Council England called Everybody is a Winner. And it covers gifts, bequests, acceptance in lieu, cultural gift scheme, and more. And it's interesting that the title of that guide is taken from a quote from David Lammy, MP, in 2006. And he said, acceptance in lieu is in nearly every way the holy grail of public policy. Absolutely everybody is a winner under the scheme. And that guide is downloadable from the Arts Council England website and from the Art Fund website. And lastly, I'd really encourage your listeners to look at a wonderful supplement that was produced by the Burlington magazine in December 24. And it's a wonderful collation of highlights from the acceptance in lieu and cultural gift schemes with a wonderful introduction and something of a history. Also, finally, there are the annual reports that Arts Council England produces each year, which are also available on our website, which provides a flavour of the amazing array of objects. As Michael has said, they don't necessarily have to be hugely valuable objects to qualify for the schemes, and you'll get a real sense of the wide variety from a steam train to a beggar's medal and musical instruments to old masters.
Brilliant. And to that little list, I would also add that there's at least one really excellent YouTube video I think produced by Art Fund with some truly amazing speakers. So I recommend that people go online and have a look for that as well. And so, yeah, no shortage of resources. But I have got another question for Michael, which is one of those ones that I don't very often get the chance to ask. And it's this, that obviously what we've heard is that the AiL scheme is a very positive thing for museums, for our institutions, for our cultural life. But it can't always, I imagine, be easy to decide what can be accepted under the AiL scheme and what can't. So what I'd like to know is what makes that decision difficult? If in principle something is an important object and comes before you and somebody says, will you accept this object in lieu of my tax bill? On what basis would you ever have to turn it down, even, for example, when you know it's preeminent and you know that the value's agreed?
Well, providing the valuation is agreed, and we could come back to how the valuation is agreed, it might depend on the condition of the object. It might depend on the provenance. And the annual limit for AiL and cultural gifts is 40 million. That's only been reached twice in the last 10 years. In fact, over the last 10 years, a total of 577 million pounds worth of objects with a tax settled of 360 million have been placed in public institutions. But that 40 million limit hasn't been raised now for about a dozen years, I think. So we are beginning to encounter, and this has happened in the past, it's not the first time, it happened about 20 years ago when the limit was much, much lower. We are beginning to find that we're having to do forward planning with regard to very large offers which come to us.
So what happens if you've got a whole bunch of objects that are all being offered in 1 year and you just know that it's going to exceed the limit? How do you approach that?
Well, we would hold a review meeting in the course of the year to project forward and take decisions accordingly.
One aspect we've been looking at is in terms of what objects you accept, and can you just help with the criteria for that? Because obviously there may be a stampede and we don't necessarily want public institutions to be saddled with things if it's not worth it. So what are the criteria?
Well, you touch on a very important point there, Richard, because it's almost like a dating agency in a way, because we take the offer, the accepted offer, but we only accept it once we're sure we've got a suitable suitor, as it were, a suitable designation for it to go. And that can be quite difficult. And if we can't find a suitable allocation, then, to be honest, the deal can't be done, because we can't use taxpayers' money to pay for objects which will not find a home. So that's a very important consideration. And when people are thinking of making offers, it's extraordinarily helpful if they have already undertaken a bit of thought about where they think would be the most appropriate home for these objects. Do you want to go into the criteria which they have to satisfy?
Yes, that'd be useful. And then we can see how that relates to institutions picking them up.
Well, there are 4 basic criteria. These were established by Lord Waverley's committee as long ago as 1952. 1 is the item of national or historical interest. B, is it of outstanding interest? I'm paraphrasing. Is it of outstanding interest within its particular discipline? C, does it contribute to the study of a particular discipline? And D, does it come from a context, perhaps a country house collection or whatever, with an incentive to keep objects together?
So is that criteria which we've come across in the export controls context as well, of looking at that degree of importance? But what's interesting is Clarissa's sort of matchmaker role, that I suppose with exporter works of art, there's a potential stop, and then you see institutions might pick it up. With acceptance in lieu, I think, Michael, and so what you're explaining is that sort of where might it go is actually an integral part of what you're doing.
Well, it is. And you can make the offer through 3 different ways, either with no specific wish on your part as to which institution it goes to, with a wish that it goes to a particular institution, or, to firm it up even more, a condition. Now, sometimes there are very, very good reasons why it's a condition, and I can see why offerers might like the seeming added degree of certainty of knowing that it's going to a particular place. But speaking frankly from the panel's point of view, we often prefer if there's no wish attached, because one of our great concerns is to ensure regional spread of allocations and suitability of institutions, and we prefer it if that is left at our discretion. We obviously respect the initial desires of the offerer, though we do ultimately have the right to overrule any of them, and we can, if we feel very strongly about something, we can determine where a particular offer should be placed.
Just to add a further point to that, is that the panel may feel strongly about the appropriate allocation of an item. But often, if it's not clear where the best place is for an item to find a home, it will be promoted on the Arts Council England website, and museums, libraries, archives, galleries up and down the country can express an interest in acquiring that object. And those expressions of interest go back to the panel for consideration. And one of the things that they are thinking about also on the panel, because this is set out very clearly in the deeds, which are signed off to finalise the arrangement, is that the allocatee can care for that object properly, but most importantly, provide public access. That is essential.
Now, one potential category of items would be objects which are already in accessible location, particularly sort of quite often when properties were donated to the National Trust, the family would donate the property but retain ownership of the chattels. Can the acceptance in lieu scheme work with the painting staying on the same wall it is in the National Trust property and simply the ownership being transferred?
Indeed, that is possible. There are in situ offers which are exactly that. And a recent allocation of a stunning painting, a Reynolds painting to Waddesdon, to the National Trust, made from the Rothschild estate, stays at Waddesdon, but the ownership now is for public benefit.
Yeah, allocations ultimately to the National Trust are relatively straightforward because that's the public-spirited body offering well-known access to the collections through its various entry charges, etc. But a more complicated in situ arrangement, which does exist, is that, for example, antique statuary at Castle Howard, which was done in 2002 and 2017, I think, a whole batch of statues acquired in Italy by the 4th Earl of Carlisle were offered in lieu of tax on both occasions on the estate. And there's an arrangement. They are under the care, they're actually allocated to the museums of Liverpool, the National Museum of Liverpool, and then placed in situ at Castle Howard because they make most sense in the context of the sculpture gallery specially constructed there for them. Those cases, they don't happen so often because there's a burden, obviously, on the country house to maintain itself in a condition where there's decent public access. And that's quite an administrative burden on the public institutions such as National Museums of Liverpool to make sure that these items are properly cared for. But these deals can be constructed as well as far as in situ is concerned.
I think it's a really beautiful example of how imaginative our tax incentives can be. You know, the more I look into it, the more I work in this area, the more I discover that only yesterday I discovered an entirely new rule, which just is an example, was in conversation with HMRC, and an example of just how thoughtful we can be, because we can apply quite a lot of discretion in these matters. And the in situ AiL is a really lovely example of that. But I have a trickier question now for Sarah. This is one that I would actually normally, you might say, why are you not asking Michael? But I'm asking Sarah because you sit in on the AiL panel meetings, don't you? So I'd be really interested in your take on what goes on. For example, where do you notice when the panel starts arguing with each other and disagreements arise? And what challenges would you say as an observer you notice coming up?
I must say it's a real privilege to be an observer on the panel. The level of expertise that one sees demonstrated in the discussions is extraordinary. So I would reframe that not as disagreements or differences of opinion, but really good discussions, rich and informed and detailed and nuanced. And the panel is made up of specialists, either from particular curatorial fields or from other areas of museum work or from a commercial background. But for each case, a number of expert advisors is handpicked as specialists in that particular kind of object to give their opinion on value and condition and preeminence. So some of the most interesting discussions, I think, are around value. And the panel and the scheme are not out to get a bargain. The value that is established has to be fair to the taxpayer as well as to the public purse. And so I think often that's an area where there's very careful consideration indeed.
Yes, if I can just add to that, Some cases are very difficult, certainly regarding valuation. It might be a sort of a commodity on which there are very few commercial experts, full stop. And somebody will come in with a valuation, and then we might feel that it's too high or too low. So we might, instead of just having one bit of outside commercial advice, we might seek a second, or in exceptional cases, even a third, because at the end of the day, we, the panel, have to take a balanced, sensible decision, and we need as much hard fact evidence as we can get. But as I'm sure Clarissa knows, valuation is as much an art as it is a science. So there's a degree of gut feeling about all this. It's very interesting. Sometimes somebody from the panel who has no expertise whatsoever in the field being considered is often the most sensible voice, because they are disengaged. They're listening to these very erudite, and boy, you learn a lot on the panel. I mean, it's a great education course. They're listening to these very erudite expositions, but they have very often the basic element of common sense and can sort of average out what is being said and also make telling comments on what fundamentally is or is not in the public interest.
I love it. I love that it works that way. I think it's such a brilliantly balanced system. And I have to say that as somebody who's worked on a lot of offers in lieu and been involved in actually helping with making the offers, I've come across more than one case where the panel has said, do you know what, we think it's worth more than you said. So we are going to accept this object and it's going to go to X institution, but it's going to be offered a bigger tax credit than was requested because we believe that it's actually worth more.
Which leads me to another point. When you are making the offer, get the best advice you can, because it'll make your life easier, it'll make our life easier.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that there's a sort of sense check for that, Michael. It's a bit from the bar perspective of the sort of the court of appeal judge who doesn't actually know anything about the particular area of law, isn't the specialist on the 3-judge panel, but can see it from afresh, and sometimes we'll sort of cut through to what the point's really about, and everyone's been too close to the topic otherwise.
Well, exactly, because you know how people can get so closely wedded to a particular figure or a strongly held conviction, and it's jolly difficult to budge them. So you sometimes need that disinterested third party to bring a resolution about.
Yeah. So coming over about the work of the acceptance in lieu panel is that you're dealing with a wider range of situations, and for example, the reviewing committee on the export of works of art, where we talked to Pippa Shirley recently, which is concerned simply with the preeminence, the Waverley criteria, and the length of the stop period, how long should it recommend as the minister, not concerned with value. And usually in export situations, the item has been sold. There is a value that's worked up. In inheritance situation, there wouldn't be a market-determined value already. So you're dealing with that. I want to ask about another area which may be in the acceptance in lieu panel agreement, but isn't on export, which are questions about the provenance and perhaps sometimes the moral elements of it, in terms of not only is there a good title, but is it potentially subject to spoliation issues from the Holocaust? Is there something potentially rather sort of distasteful about the item and its history, which may mean that it ought not to be accepted, even if it would ordinarily meet the criteria in terms of preeminence?
Yes, Richard, it's a really interesting question. The panel is concerned with provenance, whereas the reviewing committee is not. It's just answering whether or not item meets Waverley, and sometimes consideration of that for the reviewing committee. The provenance is pertinent, but they're not there to judge on provenance. For the acceptance in lieu panel, the issue of provenance is important. So it looks very carefully at an object's provenance between 1933 and 45, for example, in terms of the potential for spoliation, or if there are other gaps or oddities in the provenance which they may want to have reassurance on in terms of looted or stolen items by other means. The panel would never, for example, use the scheme for acquiring Nazi memorabilia, for example. So there are some quite obvious sensitivities there that the panel respects.
Yes, Sarah's absolutely right in what she says. And this whole issue is getting more and more complex and more detailed. I mean, fortunately, there's an exponentially increasing number of specialist websites, various national websites, European websites, other specialist websites, and these can all be consulted. It's very time-consuming and requires a great deal of resource. And of course, the major sale rooms have their own staff specially devoted to just this sort of ferreting. So again, from the panel's point of view, if those 1933 to 45 lights are glowing or something like that, please make sure that the provenance research has been as exact as it possibly can be. Because at the end of the day, if the panel were to accept something, say it was worth £1 million or more, and then down the line, many years later, there was a successful case for redress, and the work had to be returned, say, to heirs of a family from whom the item had been unlawfully seized. There's no financial recompense for the government in this case, so that's money lost to the taxpayer. So we are very, very careful, and that phrase due diligence is in capital letters. I mean, sometimes it's impossible to pin everything down. Sometimes it's looking for a needle in a haystack, but we have to have exercised all reasonable powers to ensure that the provenance is satisfactory.
So here's a question for Michael. Is there anything about the scheme that you would like to change? What would you change if you could?
Well, I think we've already touched on it. We really would like the ceiling of 40 million to be reviewed. It's not been changed for about a dozen years. And the price of things have gone up. There's been inflation, etc. So we need sympathetic hearing from the powers that be to get that raised, and we are working on that.
Yeah, I think one question about funding is consideration of creating funding alongside acquisitions. We find that a lot of museums are delighted to have this fantastic allocation made to them, but actually they lack resources to meet their ambitions, to make the most of it, and for it to have the public benefit that they would wish. So if there was some sort of funding alongside acquisition allocations that could support exhibitions or research or outreach or education programs, that would be really significant and amplify the impact of the allocations. I think there are also changes that can be made that don't require legislative change, but are things that we are actually looking at. So it's more about changes to one's understanding of the scheme rather than big changes to the scheme itself. We'd love museums, for example, to use acceptance in lieu proactively, to be talking to collectors, lenders, about what their plans might be in the future and make them aware of the acceptance in lieu scheme for when they are planning for the future. I think the way that we talk about the schemes could change. I think sometimes feel that understanding acceptance in lieu is terribly complex and difficult. And I think both Michael and I are committed to making it as clear and as simple to understand as possible. I think the way also that we talk about the schemes when we talk to potential offerors can be different. Yes, that tax incentive element is important to some people, but I think we can also appeal to their better natures in terms of saying, look, this is a way of sharing your love of wonderful art and extraordinary objects of cultural interest, and a way of building your legacy for the future, so that it's got a different kind of narrative around it.
I completely agree with that. It's something I often say, actually, when I'm talking to families about the offer in lieu scheme as an option, part of their estate planning. Actually, more often than not, it's not really about the money. It's exactly that. It's about honouring your family's collection and their collecting tastes. And if, for example, I don't know, so what comes up quite often is there'll be a family whose parents have got an absolute passion for a certain type of thing, say Victorian paintings or something, and the children are not as into it as the parents were, but they loved their parents and they want to honour their parents' kind of passions. But when the parents die, what are they going to do with this collection of Victorian paintings? Are they going to put it on their walls? Well, no. So one way of honouring the parents' collecting tastes is to pick back, say, the jewel in the crown of the collection and offer that in lieu of tax. And perhaps, no doubt, sell other objects from the collection to pay the tax bill. But it's really often more the emotional satisfaction of the offer in lieu scheme. And then forever after, you know, you'll go to the museum where the Victorian picture is, and it'll say, from the Posey family collection.
And also, if I can add on to that, if you're lucky enough to own a really outstanding object that is so valuable that its agreed worth exceeds the amount of tax to be offset, then the hybrid deal looms. And if it's an outstanding object, it's very possible to get a package together using acceptance in lieu, the Art Fund, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, maybe the Friends of a particular museum. And Bob's your uncle. With a bit of it, where there's a will, there's a way. You can very often reach the total, the desired total of what the object is worth.
In other words, you get paid for it.
Yes, an absolutely excellent example of this in recent years with the Derby Museums and Art Gallery, the self-portrait by Joseph Wright of Derby. I can't remember the exact sums, but roughly 50% of the total was acceptance in lieu, and the rest was funding secured very enterprisingly by a local authority, regional institution, going with a very well-made case to these bodies. And it was possible, and it was a great triumph. And some institutions do need encouraging to reach for the sky, as it were. It is possible.
I think those are all such valuable points, and it's really good to hear, Clarissa, that in your professional role as an agent working for people thinking about estate planning and AiL as an option, you use it very directly. The other thing that we're keen to do, as well as making understanding acceptance in lieu simple and straightforward, is to myth bust and address some misconceptions about the scheme. So some of the examples we've just been talking about are wonderful examples of fine art, but actually there's an amazing diversity of material that can be considered under acceptance in lieu. So just to pick a handful of recent examples, we've had the office of Stephen Hawking, including all its fixtures and fittings, his awards, his library, his wheelchairs. We've had some amazing archives, the archive of John le Carré just recently. So it can be very, very diverse, the material that comes to AiL.
That's right. You can go to the Bodleian right now, and the exhibition's just opened, I think, called Tradecraft on the Le Carré archive. And we'd also like to stress we get a lot of archives to consider: literary ones, political ones, military ones, county records. And these go to a variety of institutions and are of phenomenal use for scholars for generations to come. It's a very, very rewarding aspect of our work.
And on the Le Carré example, the Arts Council's 2024 Cultural Gifts Report has an extract from one of the Le Carré documents, which is part of the typescript of Tinker Tailor, Soldier Spy, with the various amendments made. And even simply on that page, it's actually quite interesting at how the text changed, reflecting the thoughts of the author and so on.
A different spectacular text that also went through was a musical text. It was Bach's complete score for his cantata for Ascension Day, which ended up in the Bodleian and through the family of a gentleman whose family had emigrated from Germany during the difficult years. And part of this whole allocation was a wish from the family to put something back into the cultural enjoyment and history of the country that had welcomed them and sheltered them.
There's a lot of sort of moving issues, preeminence, the question of where you can allocate it to the value. Get the sense that quite a few decisions could have gone one way or the other. Michael, so are there situations or decisions which you think now perhaps actually that didn't go the right way?
I think we always end up making the right decision. There might have been two right decisions for a particular case. And like King Solomon, we have to make a choice. But the discussion is very open and very democratic. And I think always the will of the majority is observed with a little bit of helpful nudging from the chair.
Well, now, I could go on with questions forever and ever, really. But I think the one I always want to ask the most, and I'll ask this to both of you, is have you had a favourite case? Have you had a favourite object that you were just so delighted to see accepted in lieu of tax?
Well, one that I took particular satisfaction from recently was a very large painting by L.S. Lowry, Matchstick Men, Northwest, Industrial Scenes, etc. I'll freely admit that Lowry is not a painter that I gravitate towards immediately. This was the best Lowry I have seen by a country mile. It's absolutely spectacular painting. And the story was so interesting because it'd been identified, I think, as a scene on the weir. It's extraordinary that a man like Lowry, who documented visually the ravages of the consequences of industry in the Northwest, should choose to take his holidays in the industrial Northeast. But there you go. And this large painting was identified as a scene of the weir. But somebody, whilst the case was being considered, said, hang on, I know what that site is. And it turns out, it's very interesting, it's something called the Lambton Docks, which used to be on the quayside in Sunderland on the River Wear. The Lambton coal mine was a private coal mine a few miles away, and the coal used to go on the trucks, come to this sort of cliff overlooking the docks, and then be tipped about 30, 40 feet down into trucks waiting below, and then taken on board the colliers waiting at the quayside. And through this identification, we changed the direction of the allocation, and it's gone to the Winter Gardens and Museum in Sunderland, which is just the most appropriate place for it to be. And I do hope the good citizens of Sunderland enjoy it as much as I do.
What about you, Sarah?
There are so many wonderfully beautiful and beautifully crafted items that have come through, and that Lowry was knock your socks off. It was really stunning. But I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm going to pick something which I think has got really important social and historical importance, which was an allocation made in 2022-23 to the Cambridge University Library. And it was the archive of Spitting Image, award-winning television show, first broadcast in 1984, which, as many of your listeners will remember, used puppets to satirise British politics and popular culture. And although its viewing figures and its reputation was very much connected to the politics at the time of the 1980s and 1990s, it really does speak to the place of comedy and satire in our society. I also like how this example slightly confounds some of the expectations that people may have of acceptance in lieu of it being about a Reynolds painting or a Joseph Wright of Derby or a Lowry. This is very much in popular culture territory, but so important and fascinating that Spitting Image have been back in the news just the last few days for their controversial depictions of Paddington the bear.
Yeah, it belongs absolutely in the great satirical tradition of this country. Long may it continue, and it's just wonderful.
Exactly. I mean, cultural importance. You can't say anything was really more culturally important than those cartoons. Well, I think that's absolutely perfect. Nothing to add. Thank you so much to you both for joining us. And we're very much looking forward, if I may trail the next one, we're very much looking forward to having you back, hopefully, for a future episode to talk about lifetime philanthropic giving and the cultural gift scheme. So thank you for today, and we much look forward to that.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.